Welcome to the finale, week 4 of our study on Bible translations. So, for those who are new to our Sunday School Online, I want to remind you guys to make sure that you leave a comment in the comment sections of the YouTube, just to let us know you're there. You know, maybe you make a comment about the weather today. I don't care, whatever you want to do, or even leave a question perhaps there. Also, I want to remind you that we've kind of been asking some big questions every week, and these questions are great for you to study together with a friend as you watch this video together, or to share on social media, by the way. And the big question for today that we've been having for this 4-week series is, which translation of the Bible should I use? What Bible translation should I use? And you can pause here and discuss, again, based on what we've learned so far. And then the question for today, really we have 2 questions, is how should we respond to the King James only movement? How should we respond to King James only? And then a final question is really going to be, what translation is best for today in the United States of America? Which is really related to the first question. Wonderful. Well, buckle up for the last that few minutes on this, and I hope that you're blessed by our discussion. I want to get into responding to King James only argument. And so the question that we have now is the King James Version the only valid Bible translation? I want to say, to kind of start this out, the 1611 King James Version preface. This is the original King James, this is 1611 King James. The one that we have today is actually kind of a further edition of the King James. But the original King James, when it was originally made, there was a preface in it that flatly denies it is a perfect translation. It even commends other translations. I strongly want to encourage you, if you hear a lot of people say you should only follow the King James, or if you kind of disregard this, wherever you're at in that kind of matrix, go back and find the original preface of the 1611 King James Version, what the translators said about their own translation. Because it's beautiful and helpful. It shows that they made this translation for the sake of God's church, and they're humble and aware that they can make mistakes. In fact, they crave and they desire other translations. The authors of the 1611 King James Bible did not believe in King James only by any stretch of the imagination. I want to say, when we do talk about the King James only, the King James Version is in fact beautiful. But the problem with the King James Version is that it does not use the best manuscripts. As we've kind of gotten to in the previous 2 discussions, there's problems with some of the manuscripts that it used, and some of them weren't problems that are inherent to themselves. The reality is that you can't expect the translators of the 1611 King James to have been aware of manuscripts that weren't discovered for centuries later, right? But also the problem with it becomes that it's translated inconsistently. So we see that with sometimes its desire to be poetic can take, maybe in one book of the Bible, when Paul uses a term over and over again, or one word in the Greek, it might translate it different ways to kind of give some kind of poetic function to that, to make it more beautiful than just repetition. But Paul's using the same word in Greek over and over. This happens on multiple occasions. Also, because the King James worked very different from other translations, most translations there's actually like a committee, and they come together and they kind of iron out, like, this is how we're going to deal with this type of manuscript issue. This is how we're going to deal with this word that's used over and over again in the New Testament. They have a significant degree of consistency. But the 1611 King James Version did not rely upon that kind of sophisticated collaborative efforts. Instead, it was like a group of translators that worked independently and then kind of submitted their work together after having kind of figured out some mentality that they wanted to bring into the King James Version. So as a result, if one person was given Romans and one person's given Galatians, both of which were written by the Apostle Paul, They might take a very different approach with certain Greek words between the two authors, despite the fact that they're the same words and they're by the same author. I think an especially important part when understanding King James Version is the King James Version uses dead words, and it is quite hard for modern readers to pick up. So, there's lots of examples of this. There's examples of words that, that almost none of you guys would recognize at first. There are a lot of, there are words, people argue then because that, you can just Google it, look in a dictionary. A lot of times you actually have to look into a dictionary that goes back to the 17th century, which is not that helpful. And the problem with that also becomes that, we want a Bible that we can give to a lost person. And we can't realistically expect a lost person reading a Bible that they don't understand to properly get some of these words that they've never read or never interacted with before. I can say I was not churched. I was not raised in Christianity much, and I was exposed to the King James Version at a young age to a degree, and there was a lot in that Bible that I did not understand. It was like Shakespeare to me that I didn't understand completely at that time. And I was a lost person again. Who was to expect me to do that kind of deep study? But the bigger problem with the language in the King James Version is actually a problem called false friends. And false friends make this translation very, very hard to use. False friends are words that mean one thing at one time, but have kind of changed their meaning. And the result of this is that you would not look up these words that are false friends. There would be no reason why you would that Google what the meaning is, because you already have a meaning in our culture. But those meanings have changed from the time that the 1611 or the modern translations of the King James came about. So one example of this is in John chapter 2, Jesus is at a wedding in Cana. And the people came to Jesus. Actually, Mary pointed out to Jesus that the people wanted more wine. The people wanted wine. And in the hold on. In the King James Version, Mary approaches Jesus and she points out that the people at the wedding party wanted wine. And if you read that in a 2020 reader, you're going to think that means like the people were craving more wine. They were just really ready to get more wine, which probably was true, but wasn't what the Bible was saying. Wasn't what the original writers of the King James Version was saying. Actually, at that time, the word wanted just meant lacked. This is probably a more common understanding, but something that my guess is if you read through the story of the wedding in Cana and the story in the King James, that's the only translation used, you would never notice that. You would just think that people wanted wine, instead of realizing that even the translators of the King James just meant to say people didn't have wine. A bigger version of this is one that I've heard a lot of sermons on, dangerously based upon the King James, even by those who are not King James onlyist. And in 1 Kings 18:21, Elijah the prophet, he's preaching to a crowd of people, and he tells them that they shouldn't halt between two positions. He condemns halting between worshiping idols and worshiping God. And so all these sermons on this text will say, that you shouldn't kind of stand there, you shouldn't cower, you need to make your decision where you're going to be. A little bit like how we misunderstand the lukewarm water. But that's not what even the original writers of the King James meant by that. Actually, this word halting in the 17th century, it didn't mean like stopping and being scared. Instead, in 17th century English, the halt meant to simply be kind of hobble, basically. It's, the act of of kind of stumble. How long are you going to stumble between two positions? And I think in that he's saying like almost you're going both ways at the same time. You're divided in your interest. It's not that you're not sure, but it's that you've committed to both in a lot of ways, which leads to a very different translation. And that's why modern translations don't use want at Cana, and why modern translations don't use halting in this instance where Elijah's condemning halting between two positions. So all of this then takes us to the big question that we're trying to get to through this study. What translation is best for today in America? I want to say lots of translations are very good that we have in America. There are a ton of great translations. I really like the New American Standard Bible. I really like the ESV. I think the CSB has a lot going for it. The NIV has a lot going for it. And I think that we can accept that even if some of these have their limitations, there's things I'm concerned with about the NIV, as I brought up before. But I can accept those limitations of the text and say that it's mostly a good Bible. And in this, I do want to say I'm including the King James Version in that. The King James Version is definitively a good translation. It's a better translation if you realize the fact that it's imperfect and you realize that it's a product of a time that had a very different language and that just didn't have the manuscripts that we had. But my personal choice, as you've probably gotten over and over, I prefer the ESV or really any formal Alexandrian text type translation. If you don't know what that means, the formal goes back to the first video and the Alexandrian goes back to the second video. I like very word for word, very literal translations. And again, the NASB is probably my second favorite, but the ESV I use a lot because I think that it is really able to be read a lot easier than some of the more literal translations or similarly literal translations. But no matter what, where you kind of land on this, an important thing to be aware of is I think consistency in a church and family is really good when you make these decisions. So I want to say you guys probably would be benefited by reading the same translation as your parents unless you have strong reasons why not to. Probably I would encourage not doing the King James Version. To be frank, for teenagers that are not able to do the detailed study, that might be beneficial. But you know, if your family uses the NIV and I'm recommending the ESV, go for the NIV together with your family. It'll allow you guys to have a kind of common language. You know, if your church uses a CSB, one day you go to a different church or whatever and they use the Christian Standard Bible, it's probably a good idea to maybe use the Christian Standard Bible. But at the same time, I do want to say we should always avoid a legalism. We've talked about the dangers of the King James Version only group, which is really, as we talked about kind of the second week, more of an issue of the Textus Receptus only. But I think we can easily become kind of snobbish and feel like ESV only in effect, even if we're not directly using that word. Be humble about it. Don't be legalistic. Realize your translation is imperfect too, and realize that there are other really helpful, good translations, and people that are probably a lot more mature than you use a different translation than you. So anyway, I hope this study on Bible translations has been helpful and relevant. I know it's been long, but I hope that it's given you the tools so that you can not just pick what translation of the Bible to use today, but so that you can make a wise decision about what translation of the Bible to use for the rest of your life when a new one comes out or a new one comes out after that. Thank you guys. I'm glad you guys joined us for this Sunday School series on Bible translations.